Morning. Just wanted to talk about a scriptures that's been on my mind for a while. This is in Luke chapter 9, 9 through 11, verses 9 through 11. And this is the time where John the Baptist was killed. And the apostles, when they were returned, told him all that they had done, meaning they had taken the body of John the Baptist, who was killed in a brutal manner, and had buried him. And this is Jesus, and he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to a city called Bethsaida. I think I pronounced that wrong. Anyway, but the point is one very small phrase. And he took them aside privately into a desert place. That phrase for me has so much meaning. Jesus constantly, through his whole life, demonstrated how God is and how he would have acted in Jesus's place. So how Jesus acted, we can see that's how God is and how he would have acted. That gruesome death of John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, the result of that action, Jesus didn't go off irrationally and say, I think I'm done with this whole life, Jesus business. I think I'm done. What did he do first? Um, he took care of his followers. He must have known, he had his own grief and pain and sorrows, but he knew his disciples needed him. I'm sure they were in shock. They were asking questions like, why did this happen? How could this happen? Explain how this is part of God's plan. How is anyone's murder or death ever part of God's plan? And some of these disciples of Jesus were even followers of John the Baptist before Jesus came along. So I'm sure they had a lot of confusion, a lot of emotion. And so, Jesus took them aside privately to place, a place of solitude before the masses showed up. And what were some of the things that he talked about? Maybe he talked about, you know, to God, there is no such thing as a shocking event. He knew when John was born what would happen to him, how he would die. He knew um, the events that would unfold. There was no shock. There was planning all along for what would happen. It was part of the plan. He allowed that to happen. It allows people's free agency to take place. So I'm sure part of his discussion was, they could place their trust in God and put all of their burdens of this emotional, huge, tragic event that had happened, place that on God's shoulders and know that God would make everything right. So I'm sure part of even the Lord's emotions, he was human. He had great pain. He suffered great pains. He dealt with a lot of grief, but he did not react to those emotions. He acted and reacted like God would in his place. So, what would most of us do in that position? I think, um, we'd go into a state of shock. I'm sure we'd maybe make plans for revenge. We'd have great anger. We would, you know, uh, place life on hold. But that's not what the Lord did. He was still on the job. So what did he do? His first thing that he did was he took his disciples out of that situation. He found a place of solitude in the desert. He removed himself from the normal situation, and he didn't become irrational. He still taught. He still healed and fed 5,000 people plus in the desert. He still did his job, even though he was suffering inside from great grief and pain and losing someone that he'd loved. And then after he was done with his job, the crowds left. Well, in John 6:15, it says, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force and make him a king, he departed again into the mountain himself alone. So after he had finished feeding this crowd, he knew that they had plans for him, and that wasn't the right thing. So he removed himself. His disciples went into the boats, and he went into the mountain. So how should we act? How do we act when we lose someone that we love? Basically, it's we put God first. And I know what you're probably thinking as well. It's easy. You're young. um, not so young anymore, but how can you say that? How do you don't know what you're talking about. Um, Unfortunately, just to keep it brief, I do know how it feels. A parent should never be asked to bury a son. Um, so I know some of those feelings. But back to God's example, God put us first. The Lord, he was still on the job, even though he was hurting. So we can have, why is that important? That's important because we know that God would act the same way. We know no matter how traumatic an event that happens in the Lord's life, he's not going to be on vacation. He never takes a day off because, oh, I'm having a bad day. This happened. I can't help anyone today because of all these things that have happened to me. Um, that's not what he does. So what pattern did the Lord follow? What pattern should we follow? Number one, I need to remove ourselves from that environment. Need to go to a place of solitude. Number three, we would need to continue to minister to others, and you would need to start with your family, start with your wife and your kids, your other sons. They still need you. They need help. And number four, continue doing your duties the best you can, even if it's just getting showered for the day and going to work somehow, even though you're an empty shell. And then the final step, after your duties are taken care of, communion with God, meditating, fasting, and praying, giving that burden to God. Some burdens in life are so great and so heavy that you can't, it's like trying to lift a car by yourself. It's just a burden that's too heavy. You have to have the Lord to help. And I follow that pattern. I tried. I tried with everything that I had in my life at that time. But the Lord is the perfect example. Let me give you a couple of examples of what happened during that time. One example is I tried to find comfort in seeking out someone that had been through something similar. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. There's value in seeking out friends and family and counselors that can help work through that grief. But there was a very successful businessman that I got to know as I was living up north in the Salt Lake area. And before I even got to know him personally, one of the first stories I heard about this guy is how he had lost a son. And they owned a cabin. I guess they still own a cabin up in Big Cottonwood Canyon area. And one winter season, they had a lot of snow. It was a typical A-frame cabin, very steep roof line. They were up at the cabin, had a lot of snow. They had snowmobiles that go out during the day and snowmobile. And there was, I don't know how many feet of snow on the cabin. And during the day, I guess it heats up and some of that snow becomes unstable. It's on the roof. Well, their son, I don't remember how old, but he was outside playing next to the cabin underneath the roof line. And inside the cabin, this young man's parents heard a big crack and a big snowbank came down on top of their son. And they immediately knew there was an issue. They ran outside, couldn't find him anywhere, and started digging. And I think by the time they found him, it was too late. Anyway, the reason I tell that story is with the purpose of seeing there was some relief he could help me and my wife with. We went to visit with him, and he was very generous, very kind, and allowed us to come to his house and talk to him for a few minutes. And there seemed to be some benefit. Um, but I mean, it didn't take away any pain. But on the other hand, when I followed a different pattern, I remember years ago, I was in southern Utah with my job at a conference, and we had a guest speaker come in. And during this guest speaker's conversation, he mentioned something about, the process of going to a bank and opening a new account, and how he had told the teller he was going through some difficult times with the divorce. And I could see or could hear with his comments that he had a lot of pain that was associated with this change in his life, huge change. And so, with the intention of helping minister or helping him in any way I could, I went to him after the meeting and I talked to him for a few minutes. And I told him I was sorry that he'd had to go through very difficult divorce, and I don't know if I could go through something that traumatic. And I happened to mention to him, what our family had been through recently. And all of a sudden the tables turned, and suddenly he was ministering to me. He gave me so much more, at least 100 times more than what I tried to give to him. Did God see what was going on? Does God do the same thing? When you're suffering with great pain and you still try to reach out to help others, what does God do in that same situation? He makes sure that that person's taken care of. That's the pattern that we need to follow, caring for others and loving others. Even though you're hurting, even though you're not in the best place possible, you're still looking to help others. Is that a way that you want to live? Is that how you would live? That's how God would live if he was in your place. Matter of fact, it reminds me of a scripture. This is in John 6, also 53 and 54. It says, Then Jesus said to them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in me. Whosoever eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I shall raise him up at the last day. Do you want to live like that? That's God. What? Sorry. Is that the way you want to live? That's the way that God would live in your place. And that's what he asks us to do. Thanks.